Thank you all for coming. We have the good fortune to kick off this session on meeting East Asian LNG demand of His Excellency Xanana Gusmão. He is the Chief Negotiator for Maritime Boundaries, the Maritime Boundary Office in the Democratic Republic of Timor. And he is going to give a keynote speech, and we'd love to hear from you. So, that's it. Did you know you were giving a keynote speech?
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be back in Abu Dhabi for the Global Energy Forum. This is the ideal place for us to come together to discuss our global energy challenges as well as our future opportunities. It also provides our country, Timor-Leste, with the chance to present our petroleum development plans and learn from the experience of the UAE. With its vision and leadership, the UAE could also provide great insights for the Asian region in building a sustainable future. Across East Asia, we see increasing demand for energy, when the type of energy we use will determine whether the world meets a different challenge, climate change. These two connected challenges will be the story of East Asia in this new century. With its growing economies and fast rising population, Asia continues to be the engine room of global economic growth. We have already seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, urbanization on a massive scale, and the rise of global powers, including China, India, and South Korea. In Southeast Asia, the population increased by 23% between 2000 and 2017 and continues to rise strongly. This is leading to the emergence of countries of the future, including Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. All of these development and these people and these industries bring with them an enormous demand for energy. In Southeast Asia alone, demand is up more than 60% in the last 15 years. And is currently growing at twice the pace of China. Southeast Asia's energy demand is predicted to grow by almost 2 times by 2040. The countries that grasp these trends and the opportunities they provide will shape our global future. And the UAE knows this well. After all, 73% of the Gulf's energy exports go to the Asia Pacific, meeting almost half of the region's demands. However, much of Asia's rising energy demands are being met by coal. The Asia Pacific produces 70% of the world's coal and is also its biggest user. And this means greater global emissions of carbon dioxide and climate change. I come from a country that is half island nation and from a region of many island states. Climate change and rising sea levels pose an existential threat to countries in our neighborhood. So what should we do? Natural gas provides a bridge to a lower carbon future, and across East Asia, the demand for gas will continue to rise. In Timor-Leste, we can see this feature, and we know that we can help contribute to the solution and respond to the rising demand for gas. The good news is that developing our petroleum industry will also transform our economy, create jobs and build a foundation for our long-term future. And so this is not only good energy policy, it is good economic and social policy. Following our historic maritime boundary treaty with Australia, we have now secured the majority of one of the biggest or largest gas fields in Southeast Asia. We call it Greater Sunrise. And so we are planning for the exploitation of Greater Sunrise to become an anchor for the opening up of other known fields and potential new fields in the region, and for it to underpin the development of a regional petroleum hub on the south coast of our country. The Xanana project, as we call it, will establish a 100-mile corridor along our southern coast that includes the construction and operation of a refinery, petrochemical plant, LNG plant, a linking highway, as well as seaports and airports. Experts project that the total revenue from the development of Great Sunrise, including LNG production, will reach over $58 billion and create 58,000 jobs for the Timorese people, all because we want to ensure that the jobs of the industries that come from our resources stay in Timor-Leste on our shores for our people. We are also looking to develop our immediate region and have established a trilateral initiative to promote Timor-Leste, East Indonesia, and Northern Australia social and economic integration, including fisheries, transportation, tourism, and marine security, as well as our petroleum industries to respond to growing East Asia gas demand. While we are just starting, we know that we can learn from others who have traveled at the same path, countries like the UAE that have the experience and the leadership to build the foundation of a positive future. This includes the need for economic diversification and long-term sustainability. But we have already made a good start. From the very beginning, we have seen our natural resource wealth as the foundation of a diversified economy. We also put every dollar from our petroleum resources into our fully transparent petroleum plant, which has now grown to over 17 billion today. Ladies and gentlemen, I am confident that working together, we can achieve the global low-carbon economy we need. And I'm also confident that we can meet East Asia's energy demand. Timor-Leste can be a part of the solution to these challenges. And in order to respond to East Asia's demand for gas, we can build our petroleum industry and a diversified economy to meet the dreams and aspirations of Timor-Leste's next generation. And so I look forward to our panel discussion and to learn more from all the distinguished leaders and experts here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, and I would invite our panelists up. And while they're coming up, I'm Melanie Kenderdine. I am a senior non-resident fellow for the Atlantic Council, and also, if you can stay here or whatever you would like, sir. Great, thanks. Okay, thank you. And have two businesses with Secretary Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, and I'm thrilled to be here today with our panelists. What I thought I would do is start off this panel with a few framing slides, and I think it'll, I don't know about the people in the audience, it'll help orient me. These are, I need to be oriented. These are these are IEA numbers, global energy investment, second year in a row. Electricity surpassed oil and gas supply, and that has been historically not the case. What you're seeing there, 750 billion in electricity, only 17 billion in nuclear. I spoke here on nuclear yesterday. Fossil, 132 billion. Renewables, 298 billion. This is what the investors are betting on, okay? Networks, 303 billion. Then you've got your oil and gas supply over here, 716 billion. We put coal in this, as my staff put coal in there as well. But 716 compared to 750 billion. You get down there, efficiency and renewables and transport and heat. This is production, consumption, gas production, consumption, proved reserves. I added technically recoverable reserves at the last minute. I know there's a lot of dispute about that, but when I looked at the US here, proved reserves, this is from BP, proved reserves were only 308 TCF, and I didn't want people to think that we were going to be running out of gas in 10 years because our consumption is 2594, consumption is 2612. And then you go around the world here. Turkmenistan, I was surprised by their reserves. Qatar's no one's surprised by that. Russia and Iran. I think there's dispute on the numbers between Russia and Iran. This says Russia has the most reserves. Others say Iran does. This is global gas consumption growth by region. And the first bar is 2005, 2011. The next one's 2011, 17, and then 17 to 23. And what you see here, North America gas consumption is up, but it is declining up in the third bar here, 27 to 2013. These are IEA numbers, okay? It shows China going up. Somebody asked me about that. They thought it was the opposite, but this shows China going up, Middle East going down, other Asia Pacific going down and up a little bit, I don't know why, and then Eurasia and Europe going down. This is 2016 BP statistical review. I haven't had time to update it because I do my own animations and it's hard. But this is pipeline volumes coming up here. Okay, this is LNG volumes coming up. And this is LNG capacity additions that were under construction. Not announced projects, but are under construction to be finalized by 2020. And so this is, they're coming up. And what you see from that is by 2020, globally traded LNG plus new LNG capacity could, if all that capacity is utilized, it won't all be utilized, approximate international pipelines volumes, which is almost unthinkable, okay, that it is now approximating pipeline volumes, and what that to me is indicative of the development of the global gas market, and says a lot of good things about LNG, I think. And this is, we were talking about the Panama Canal before this, before we opened the panel. Only 23 of the existing 421 LNG vessels could go through the canal before they widened it. Now, nearly 90% can go through the Panama Canal, and that's a savings of 42% of time going from west to east, transporting gas LNG. I was there in March or April and saw a tanker moving through. It was amazing. And U.S. LNG volumes to Asia through the Panama Canal are expected to exceed 3 BCF a day. That's EIA numbers. And then finally, this was a little surprise to me too. This is our LNG export growth in the U.S. and large volume customers. This was EIA August of 2018, a few months ago. You can see the huge increase there. Then this is Mexico, number one, substantial. And you can see how they're coming up here. What I thought was interesting, and I will make no judgments about it, was China was 3,588 MCF a month. In April, this is August, in April it was 17,000. So I don't know if that's one tanker, or if it's a reflection of what's going on with trade. I thought it was an interesting piece of information. So that just gives you a little background, and the panelists a little background on some of the data that we have been looking at. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists. And first, we have at the end Dr. Ken Koyama. He is the chief economist and managing director at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Next is Jean-Francois Seznec, and he is another non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, an adjunct professor at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins Universities. And then sitting next to me on my left, Bob Fee. Bob was the VP for VP for International Affairs at Cheniere, and Bob was the Chief of Staff at the Office of Fossil Energy in the Obama administration, and we worked together. And then he was stolen to go work at Cheniere. So those are the panelists, and I think it would be nice if you all said a few words. If you would like, in your own framing, I've given mine, and start with Dr. Koyama.
Thank you, Melanie, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this great forum. I'm doing research on energy, including LNG in Japan. As you know, that Japan is the largest LNG importer in the world. It happened that this year, 2019, is the 50th anniversary of Japan's first LNG from Alaska. So, as a big importer, we still think that LNG continues to play a big role in Japan's energy mix. But as this topic of this session illustrate, LNG or natural gas in Asia need to play a bigger role in Asia as a region. In 2017, that the natural gas account 12% of total Asian primary energy mix. So gas is a very significant source of energy, but the share of Asian gas is much lower than the global average of 23%. So in other words, we have a much room to see the bigger role of gas or LNG. And actually, as everybody know very well, that gas demand and LNG demand in particular in Asia is rising, in particular in China, which surprised everybody in 2 years' time, 2 years back. So I do believe that there's no doubt that the direction is what is concerned. There's a growing, growing trend for gas LNG demand in Asia. But the question remains, at what pace, at what speed that gas or LNG in Asia can grow? I think that there are several very important factors to affect the appetite for LNG in Asia. Firstly, of course, the economic growth is a very important determinant of energy and LNG demand in Asia. We all know that the Chinese economic growth, although now it's a 6% level, it matters a lot if the Chinese growth remained at 6% or 5% or 7%. It depends heavily on the economic growth in China, in India, in the ASEAN country, and South Asian countries. And also the second part of the story is environmental regulation. How serious the government, including central government and regional government, try to address the environmental problem, not only for climate change, but also air pollution problem. It's a very, very important determinant for affect the appetite for LNG. And thirdly, we must look at the situation of energy competition among sources. LNG or natural gas in Asia need to compete with coal, nuclear power, and renewable maybe in the future. Of course, we all know that the intermittent renewable energy source and natural gas can be a good fit. But at the same time, there is a competition among among energy sources. So, and also the final issue is at what level that LNG, at what level of prices that LNG demand in Asia can soundly grow, in particular for the developing or emerging economy. Probably there is some difference between the more mature LNG market like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and emerging market in India and South Asia and Southeast Asia. If LNG price remain $6 per million BTU, $7, $8 million per million BTU, it may be okay. But if it goes up $10, $11, $12, to clearly affect the speed of the appetite. I'll stop here.
Jean-Francois?
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to the panel. I think it's very nice to see you all here. I'd like to draw your attention to the booklet you have on your seat here. This is something we prepared at the Atlantic Council. I have my name on it, but the Atlantic Council is half responsible for all the mistakes, of course. But I encourage you to take it and to have a look at it. So I will not talk much about the report because it's all in there. What I'd like to just give a small idea of where I came from on all this. About some 25 years ago, Ahmed Zaki Yamani was Minister of Oil in Saudi Arabia for many years, had published a nice piece in the Middle East Economic Survey, which really where he went in great deal of details on the cost of LNG and what was the advantage of LNG. And basically his conclusion that LNG is very important for the future, and in those days there was almost no LNG, but it's very important for the future of energy in general, but only for distances over 1,500 kilometers. And he really was thinking that when you could not put a pipeline and the distance was more than 1,500 kilometers, you would use LNG. So he was really pointing out about what the greatest advantage of LNG is, which is flexibility. And this has not changed. It's very important. LNG is shipped from Qatar to China, is shipped from all over the world to other places all over the world. But this flexibility has had an interesting twist in the past few years, where the ability to diversify has also been used as a bypass for political problems. I mean, I find always very humorous that Kuwait is actually has built a LNG receiving plant, and Kuwait was buying LNG from Sakhalin Island, which is somewhat nonsensical. Bahrain is opening an LNG regasification plant now as we speak, and they are literally within sight of the largest gas field in the world. So I think part of the problem, what I'm pointing out here, is that one of the inconvenience, if you like, of LNG is that it allows people to bypass their political problem and not resolve their own issues. So, this Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Qatar is not the only problem. There's India, Pakistan, the Tapi pipeline is not happening, so India is buying more and more LNG. And it's very unlikely to happen, this pipeline, and anytime in the near future. The problems between Turkey and Cyprus is creating the same issue. So we can go on and on like this. That's really one of the points I just wanted to make here. The advantage, of course, is very much flexibility. The inconvenience, though, of LNG remains. It's still a very expensive source. I mean, Kuwait is buying gas from Sakhalin or some other places, and but to make the LNG, you still have the cost of production, which is quite high. It's not very high ultimately, but it's quite high. It's certainly cheap, more expensive than oil. You have the shipping costs, which go up and down and up and down. And this morning you mentioned that lately, sometimes the spot price on some tankers has been up to $200,000 a day, even though on average you're probably lower than that. And then you have to regasify it. So unless you really transport it for a long distance and it makes the effort worth it, you know, sending gas to Kuwait or to Bahrain is pretty much nonsensical, really, in terms of economics. But this is quite a point to remember. The other point which I have mentioned in the report, and I sort of conclude that in the report, is the Chinese issue and the tariffs with China. As you mentioned this morning, and has been mentioned in various other panels, of course, China is the key factor in the growth of demand for natural gas and LNG in particular. And therefore, you know, there has been some feeling that the US industry is growing so much that it is very dependent on Chinese demand for gas. And when China puts 10% tariffs, and perhaps even more if we fail in our present negotiations, it will hurt the United States. And I actually disagree with that, because I think that in fact it will hurt China mostly, because China needs the oil, the gas, the natural gas very badly, and the advantage of liquid natural gas is the flexibility. If Cheniere doesn't sell gas to China, he'll sell it to Spain, and the Qatari gas that was going to Spain is going to come to China. So basically, it will displace the Qatari gas worldwide. The Qatari gas will go to China. The problem with that, in my view, is that China needs to diversify its suppliers. That's been their policy forever in terms of oil supplies. It's beginning to be their policy for gas. They get gas from Russia and also from Myanmar. The advantage of LNG is that it allows you to diversify your suppliers. And at this point, if we take away the United States from the Chinese market, China really will lose the ability to play that market, which is becoming very, very large, and certainly can be the marginal supplier to the marginal demand in China. So this is what the report is really about, and it's a very, very interesting topic for me to be looking at. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, thank you. And Bob, a few words from you?
Thank you, Melanie. I'm having some flashbacks to a couple of years ago when we were in meetings with the secretary. Putting me on the spot.
What does that mean?
So,
Fifth Amendment.
yeah, it's a lot to follow up on. So looking forward to a good conversation. You know, certainly, you know, talking about Asian demand when it comes to LNG makes a lot of sense. In 2018, the LNG market was around 320 million tons. Asian demand was around 240. So it is the major market. It is the growth market. Indeed, since Cheniere's started operations at Sabine Pass in February 2016, nearly 50% of all U.S. LNG has gone to Asia. I guess to kind of touch on 2 points that Koyama-san and Jean-Francois made, you know, growth for Asia is definitely driven by economic growth and policy. A lot of those policies, particularly by China, were enabled because of the availability and also the relatively price of LNG. And China's growth certainly has surprised the upside the past 2 years and has been really phenomenal, increasing 46% in 2017 and almost 50% in 2018. Melanie, the slide that you showed that talked about kind of the low level of U.S. export, it looked like that was a picture in time August 2018 flows, and so that was just before the Chinese put tariffs on U.S. LNG in September, but they had kind of anticipated the flows, so the answer is yes, those were affected because of the tariffs. So certainly we've seen in 2018 with the onset of the tariff that the LNG market is fungible, but it's not perfectly fungible, and there are friction costs associated with redirecting those U.S. volumes to other markets and bringing those other volumes to China. I think, not to focus too much on China in my initial remarks, but that those friction costs were relatively low this winter because it was a relatively mild winter in China. China, as well as South Korea and Japan, had bought a lot. Inventories were high, had bought a lot in the summer, and there was a lot of floating LNG on the water. So when the Chinese were trying to move cargoes, it was a little bit more feasible for them to do so and not too costly. If it had been a really cold winter and the market prices had been higher, and I think it would have been interesting to see because I think you would have seen U.S. LNG maybe landing in China despite that. So you saw even cargoes from Cheniere's Sabine Pass facility not go to China, despite the fact that it was some of those volumes were part of a long-term deal that we signed in February of last year. I think the last point, just to think about kind of discussion going forward. So the title of your report is, and this panel is Meeting Asia LNG Demand. I think 2019 is going to be really interesting to think about what projects FID to meet future Asian LNG demand. And there are a number of projects around the world. It's a pretty fierce global competition. It'll be interesting to see which projects go forward. I would agree with Jean-Francois, your comments that the tariffs hurt China more than they hurt the U.S. Perhaps I would say that they hurt U.S. LNG exporters more than they hurt China. So we'll see, but I am concerned about what Koyama-san raised, which is kind of demand destruction if prices get too high. So important for kind of projects, including U.S. LNG, to be sanctioned, keep prices low so we can ensure that we're meeting Asia's growing growing energy demand with flexible, relatively low-cost LNG. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say that a little over 5 years ago, I was at MIT getting ready to start working for Secretary Moniz. He wasn't secretary yet. We were both at MIT. And I received a call from the White House. And it was before I started. And that was about approving an LNG export permit for the United States, our first approval. And it's amazing to me how far we have come. I was just thinking about it, looking at the slides and hearing this discussion, that the entry of the United States into that market has made major changes, and I think reflected in the slide I showed, the pipelines and LNG volumes, that the development of that global gas market is an incredible thing to watch, and people here are part of that. And Dr. Koyama, that leads me to ask you a question: what role can or does the U.S. play in the developing Asian LNG market?
Thank you very much. Clearly, from Japanese or other Asian LNG buyers' viewpoint, U.S. LNG is a very important source of, firstly, diversification of supply and also diversification of contract style. In particular, that last year was a very, very interesting year to me because of the rise in the oil price in the early part of the year. That JCC-linked LNG, traditional LNG, became very expensive. As compared to that suddenly that Henry Hub priced US LNG became very attractive. So that's why I think that many Asian buyers review again what's the role of US LNG in that period. So in that sense, I think that the price relation between JCC-linked LNG and Henry Hub-based LNG from the United States continue to play a very, very important role to determine the shape of the LNG market in Asia. And furthermore, as my fellow panelists pointed out, the flexibility is a very important issue for energy buyers in general, but in particular for example, country in Japan, country like Japan, where several very important specific factors start to work. One is the uncertainty of a nuclear power restart. And second is the inflow of large-scale inflow of renewable energy, like solar PV or wind power. And third is market liberalization, where for the incumbent players feel it very uncertain over the demand level of electricity sales or gas sales. So in that context, the flexibility is a great attractiveness. So I think that apart from that price comparison between the JCC level and Henry Hub priced energy, I think that the flexibility is a value. So in that context, that the growing US LNG inflow to Asian market will continue to transform the market in Asia. And third point is again the pricing issue. As everybody knows, that now many Asian governments, including China, Singapore, Japan, and Korea, is trying to develop a concept of hub. I have to say that the hub, LNG hub or gas hub in Asia is a long way to go as compared to the situation in the United States or Europe. But actually, we are going to have a gradually flexible market in Asia. So in that context, the growth in US LNG to Asian market clearly helped to develop more functional or well-functioning gas market. So that's my point.
Thank you. Thank you. And Jean-Francois, I want to ask you, I showed the reserves of Iran in my slide. I'd like to ask you, it has the largest or second largest reserves in the world. Could they become a major LNG supplier?
The short answer is no. In terms of the reserves, it's depending on whom you read. If you read the Iranian sources, of course, they're by far the largest over Russia. And so we don't really know where the truth is. But they are very large. They have very large reserves. The reason the way I said no, they will not become LNG is a political reason, very simply. Because most of the technology, and I'm not the man to talk about this, you should be talking about that, but the technology is really fundamentally American and Western, and as long as Iran has problems with the US and the rest of the Western nations, that technology would not lend to Iran. I mean, even China would need, if they were going to build LNG plants in Iran, which they were planning to do over 10 years ago, that will not happen because China would have to get the technology directly or indirectly through the US, which would not happen. So for them, it's a very bad situation because they may have the largest reserves, so they say, but and they have a fairly large production, but the production is used mostly to re-inject into the oil field to get the oil up. And it is used to a certain extent to develop petrochemicals, but they're not very successful at that because they have nice plants, but the plants cannot operate more than 50% by and large because they don't, the feedstock is not arriving. The fields are not in good health. And again, it's a political issue, because in order for the fields to work, they would need technology from Halliburton and Schlumberger and people like this, and it's not going to happen for the future. So Iran has the potential, they have the talent, if you like, but they just have the inability, they're totally unable to develop their wealth, really. It's too bad.
Thank you. Bob, what challenges are there to greater LNG utilization in Asia? What do you see in that regard?
Thanks, Melanie. So I think, touching on my comments earlier, I think one of the, and something that Koyama-san brought up as well, is the issue of energy and the energy competition and price. So for LNG, you have a phenomenal demand growth in parts of Asia. There's projected to be phenomenal growth in LNG demand. So South Asia by 2025 is expected to double. Southeast Asia is expected to triple. But the question of LNG is often LNG versus coal. And so Asia, in addition to the numbers I cited earlier about being a massive driver of the global LNG market, also is responsible, I believe, for 75% of coal consumption. So kind of thinking about LNG, when, as Jean-Francois points out, it is it's natural gas, it's liquefied for transportation. So that liquefaction process is expensive. It would be better to transport it over a pipeline or more efficient. But if that's not available, how do you get the gas there? So making sure that we can keep gas at a relatively low price so it can compete with coal is important. I think along those lines, I think policy will be important. So you've seen China's demand growth for LNG determined primarily by environmental policies, not necessarily carbon, but I think someone earlier today said desmogrification, and it is tackling air pollution and trying to improve air quality. Now China has the luxury to do that because of kind of where they are in their development cycle and because of where LNG prices were. Thinking about countries in South and Southeast Asia, it's a little bit more difficult. So thinking about how they can kind of address air quality issues when they are really focused on meeting, basic electrification needs. So I think about Vietnam, which recently hit 100% electrification. They are very focused on keeping the lights on. They don't necessarily have the luxury to think about, well, how do we use a more expensive fuel to clean the air quality? So, I think thinking about policy, I think Western nations can help on that. There's an element of carbon as well. I think, I still think it's important for the U.S. to support the Paris Agreement. Cheniere believes that as well. I think the U.S. can take a leadership role with developed countries to help on this issue. So, China's Belt and Road Initiative on energy primarily has been developing coal plants along the Belt and Road. Japan and South Korea are also financing coal plants in South Asia, in South and Southeast Asia. The U.S. reversed Obama administration rule to not finance coal projects. So I think it would be useful for U.S. leadership to help lead and kind of work with our allies and work with developed nations to help push for kind of some of the support that can help developing countries make difficult and costly policy decisions.
Thank you. I would like to ask one more question of any of the panelists that would like to answer or not, and then open it up for questions. I have had somebody give me a timesheet here. We're going to get pulled off the stage shortly, but let me ask, and this is my own personal interest. In 2002, I set up a company to do shale gas R&D in the United States, and companies still exist. They were wildly successful. But I'm wondering, and that's enabled us to, I think, enter the LNG export market, and I had no understanding of the implications for oil production, unconventional oil. I was only looking at gas. My question, my question is, and my son's a petroleum engineer now, just graduated, and his minor at MIT was Chinese. He wants to go produce shale gas in China. That was his dream. I'm wondering if there are disruptions that you might see in the LNG market with China if there was development of their shale resources. They do have significant shale resources, and if anyone has any thoughts on that. I know they have problems developing it, but any
if you don't mind me taking the first cut of that. So I go back to the comment you made to open up this panel is, think about how much the world has changed in just 5 years. So we were talking about U.S. LNG, 5 years ago as a theory, and now it's in practice. 10 years ago, no one was talking about U.S. LNG. So I think your question about disruptions is a great question. It's probably broader, right? So what disruptions globally?
Climate change responses too could disrupt gas demand. So, okay.
On China specifically, so when we used to work with the Department of Energy together, the Department of Energy and Department of State used to spend a lot of time before they promote natural gas like they do now, or LNG, they worked on how to promote hydraulic fracturing across the world. And they spent a lot of time in China thinking about how do we develop unconventional resources in China. You could do a panel on the difficulties there. Technology, geology, regulatory. I think the biggest indication, though, is China's 12th five-year plan talked about increasing production of natural gas through unconventional. I don't know the levels, but it was something from what their nominal level is now to 4 times that. Their 13th five-year plan did not include those production targets, but instead talked about utilization of natural gas, including imports. So I think that there's a long way to go. I mean, the shale revolution in the U.S. took 30 plus years. So it's not as easy as just kind of exporting technology or utilizing technology. So I think it would certainly be a massive disruption, right? But I think that's probably not a 5-year scenario.
Right. I'm glad you said it took 30 plus years. Most people say it happened overnight. It didn't.
In terms of supplies and disruption, I'm more specialized on the Gulf region here. So one interesting factor on that is with the discoveries in Saudi Arabia and actually in Bahrain of very large tight gas deposits, and that would imply very large scale fracking needed. And if they were doing that, they could become very large producers of gas. Now, of course, it's a bit crazy because the fracking will end up costing a lot more than having the dry gas coming up out of the sea in Qatar. But nevertheless, that could displace, to a certain extent, Qatar as a main exporter if the Saudis decide to go that way. The technology, the Saudis have extremely advanced and good technology for oil, but not so much for gas. And so they would have to rely on Halliburton, with which they have a very good relationship. Bahrain is the same case, except more difficult because Bahrain doesn't have the capital, which Saudi Arabia has, or the experience. But that would make big changes. It would allow Saudi Arabia to move away from being so dependent just on crude oil exports. So that could be a disruption, or an addition, I guess, but to a certain extent, a disruption to the oil markets.
I have many chances to talk with my Chinese friends and colleagues about the shale development in the country. Clearly, that people in the government side has a big ambition to develop shale resource in a big way. As was pointed out in the previous 5-year plan, the big target, and they're still trying to increase their shale gas production. Actually, they have succeeded in producing shale gas in Sichuan Basin. But through these experiences, I think that they understand that deposit of shale gas in this region is more complex and more deep. Naturally, it's more costly. In particular, from the viewpoint of the incumbent or existing player like CNPC, they have much lower cost of production conventional gas. So I think that from the economic point of view, it is quite difficult to see the big increase in shale gas in the near future. And also, we need to understand that for the shale development, and at this moment, we need to have the plenty of supply of water. But in China, as you know, that as a country, that the shortage of oil is more imminent. So there is several other possible constraining factors to see that the large-scale shale development in China in the mid-term future. In the long run, there is a possibility that technological and social development may change the situation. But I think that from the disruptive point of view, more big factors is economic growth, firstly economic growth, and secondly the pipeline gas, in particular from Russia. After the experience of rise in the spot price in winter time in 2017, Chinese government and industry became very keen to develop and survive the concept of Russian gas, firstly East Siberian, and now they're talking with Arctic gas pipeline. If they are successful in developing the large-scale pipeline gas from Russia, that will seriously affect the energy appetite in China.
So the expert advice is that my son should look for a job elsewhere.
If I could make a comment on what Ken was mentioning, well, I just forgot my thought.
I do that all the time.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
So are there any questions in the audience? Yes, sir. If you could say who you're with.
Thanks, I'm Patrick Award from Danagas, CEO of Danagas. Just coming back to the point Jean-Francois made about the apparent economic unattractiveness of short-term or short-distance LNG. I think you obviously need to factor in the reliability of supply. And taking the world's second largest gas supplier, or at least owner of gas resources, namely Iran, they have 3 gas export contracts, one to Turkey, one to Armenia, very small, and one to the UAE, which we are the recipient of. They haven't delivered that gas over the last 15 years. They have had an arbitration with Turkey. So when it comes to that kind of unreliability as a supplier, because once you've got a pipeline between point A and point B, you are extremely dependent on the person at point A from delivering. When you have that kind of track record and history of unreliability of supply, then it makes absolute sense to diversify your security and to get LNG, even if it means, in fact, I think in the case of Dubai, and I think there was a cargo to Kuwait when the LNG came from Qatar. So clearly under those circumstances, it would make ultimate sense for Iran to be supplying everybody in the Gulf with gas by pipeline. But there are obvious reasons why that's not happening.
Yeah, the same can be said of Qatar. Qatar could be supplying by pipeline all over the place. By the way, the thought I had lost, which
I was going to ask you if you remember.
Yes, it had to do with the fact that the technology is changing very rapidly on the fracking, and that's why the Saudis are now a little more interested in their big, large, tight gas deposits, and it could apply in China. So those are not waterless technologies, but technologies that use less water, developed mostly by Schlumberger in the U.S. So that would be a game changer if it really develops and it's not too expensive. But they are testing those techniques everywhere.
Are there any other questions in the audience? If not, let's give a hand for, Darryl.
Thank you. I think I have a question to Professor Koyama. Interesting to hear your views about the price at the moment for LNG prices in Asia. You said at the end of your intervention that the range of 6 to 8 MMBTU price would be reasonably okay for Asian market, but then if it is beyond that, it could be a challenge. Now, I would like to see your views on, in the long run, the competitions of supply, be it in price or in the product, between the, while in Asia, as you rightfully said, and also other panelists, that while we have a high demand, but also we have emerging suppliers in the region. While also across Atlantic, we have shale gas coming over. So we'd like to see your views on these competitions. To what extent is Southeast or Asian regions and LNG suppliers can compete with the shale gas in the long run? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Firstly, that my point I made in my previous intervention was $6-8 is not. I don't mean that 6 to 8 is reasonable or not. What I saw in the actual marketplace in 2016 and 2017, that there was a very sound, substantial growth in LNG demand in emerging market in Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So I pose the question, if these levels can continue, we may expect the sound growth can continue even in the emerging market. So there's no guarantee that if the price level goes up beyond 10, 11, 12, I cannot guarantee there's no similar trend of growth can continue in the emerging market. So the reason there's some uncertainty is it matters, again, from the economic growth side and environmental regulation side. Even that the $10 LNG can grow if the environmental restriction can be very, very stringent, for example, in Delhi or in India. So it is a very complicated story. But if we assume that gas price, LNG price can go to some degree beyond $10, clearly it will affect the growth speed or appetite. So under the circumstance, I think that there is a competition among suppliers, and probably the good position, the winner or take a good position is a local supplier. It's a natural economic competition. That's my point. I didn't say that the 6 to 8 is a reasonable price. It's greatly affected by various factors. As I pointed out, that the Japanese buyers probably can pay $10, $11, $12. In history, that actually we paid about $18 after the nuclear accident. So the market situation differs greatly by country in Asia.
Great, thank you. And we are out of time. I would like to thank Excellency Gusmão again. Thank you very much, and thank the panelists, and thank you all for coming. And I thought it was a great panel.